You can check the full bios of the panelists, access their presentations, check the videos we've posted yesterday and today. You have not done yet this watching so far. So there are 3 short videos on nature-based solutions, nature needs half, and on convivial conservation. Thank you, Amy, Bram, Krista, and Swati for having recorded those. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the brilliant participation of the members of the Common Futures platform. Samantha, Mwape, Julia, Agnes, and Matthias, thank you very much for having sent a video, which is very much appreciated. When it comes to questions, we would very much like you to post questions to any or all of the panelists. So you can do that using the Q&A button, which is you see at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to ask questions live, please say so in the Q&A box. And you can also raise your hand, and my colleagues, Melissa, Claire, and Anum, will be collecting them and letting me know if you want to ask the question live. And finally, audience members, you're very welcome to tweet using the hashtag #CHForests. Right, we can move to the next slide. We are now about to start the final panel of this series on emerging and radical ideas for forests. We have 4 speakers lined up, and I'm going to be chairing it. Again, my name is Thiago Herrera. I grew up in Brazil, and I'm a researcher at Chatham House, and I've been negotiating and implementing policies on land use, forests, climate change, and public procurement for some 15 years. In this final panel, we are honored to have Samuel Ngifo, Hua Fanhuan, Vanessa Nakate, and Bhaskar Vira, all 4 passionate about forests and bring to the panel a variety of expertise and experiences. So without further ado, let's start with Samuel Ngifo. Samuel is a lawyer, defender of the commons, and for his effort in promoting tropical rainforests, he's also been awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize, which is also known as the Green Nobel. Samuel is director of the Center for Environment and Development in Cameroon. Samuel?
Thank you, Thiago. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank you, Thiago, and thank all the organizers of this event. And I would like to start by talking about the excellent videos that I had the chance to watch, and I really think you had the chance to watch it as well. But they have something in common, the 3 of them. They reminded us very well of the unique nature of the forest and the importance of the forest for the people, but more for the planet also, and for the future of humanity. But when I was seeing them, and I was thinking about what we see in the Congo Basin, and I started seeing the forest again worldwide as a new battleground of the fight between those who are really caring about a common future and those who are looking at nature as something that can provide quick benefit, quick private gains. And I think this will be the fight for us. If we are able to win this fight, if those who are caring about the common future and trying to see the place that the forest will be playing in this common future succeed in having their views heard and implemented by policymakers, I think we will have won something. So I have 3 points, three quick points that I wanted to share today. The first is a view of how the forest has been managed in Central Africa and probably in the rest of the world, in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And from what we saw, we are witnessing that forest management so far has not worked. It has been a disaster for the people who have been totally dispossessed since the beginning, the very early days of colonization. The state became almost everywhere, the owner of the forest, the colonial state. an organized exploitation of the forest in a way that was totally different from what communities used to do. And this was the beginning of the disaster for the people. They lost their rights, they lost their access to land, they lost the decisions making power that they had on the land and on the forest. And they lost it to people who did not live that close to the forest and whose life did not depend on the forest. These were investors of the state. Forest management so far has been a disaster also for the forest. And when we look at some countries who were forested countries and who are now net importers of timber, we see the future of what some of the forested countries today will be looking like. I remember a logger 20 years ago telling us in Cameroon that there's no need to care about forest management, about management plan, because as he said, the future of your forest in Central Africa is palm tree. He said it's a trend that you cannot stop. We start by logging, and then the second wave will be palm tree. So it does not work for the forest. The forest has been disappearing. And it's not working for the planet. It's not working for the planet because by doing what we did in destroying the forest, we collectively basically agreed to undermine our future, to mortgage our future against quick, short-term private gains. And now it is obvious that what is happening to us is the nature biting us back for all what we have been doing in the past century or century and a half in Latin America, Africa, and Asia to the forest. The forest, the nature is biting us back, and we start witnessing a lot of problems that we did not know, and also seeing a very dark future for us in terms of access to natural resources, access to food for communities, in terms of fighting poverty. It becomes an issue and we don't know how to get out of it because of the way we have been managing land and the forest. The second point I wanted to share is that when we read all the documents talking about forest management, we see these three pillars: economy, ecology, and social, cultural. But these three pillars are totally unbalanced when you go back on the field. You see that economy is very clearly dominating everything. But when I say economy, it's not the local economy, it's the global economy, the timber trade, basically. And if you look back at the forest, timber is a very tiny portion of the economic value of the forest. So we have like a consensus to lose the biggest part of the forest in order to get money from the smallest part of the forest. The total turnover of non-timber forest product is by far higher than the turnover of logging. There was a study done in Cameroon by the Dutch University around 20 years ago, and the result was that the value of non-timber forest product in one region in Cameroon, and not the most populated region in Cameroon, was by far higher than the total turnover of the logging sector for the whole country. We have to think about this type of data and think about what we consider as being the best economic move when we look at the forest. So when we talk about economy, I think we are totally misleading. Very quickly, another point is that there are ways out. There are ways out, and I would like to quote one figure from the FAO. The FAO says 7%, around 7% of the world forest are plantations. And this 7% provides almost 50% of logs worldwide. So it means it is possible to meet the global demand of timber with timber from plantations. I don't want to say that plantation doesn't have any problem, but I think we have less problem in plantation than in natural forest. And my point is to see how can we get out of natural forest especially if they are so useful, so valuable, not only for timber trade. We can get timber from somewhere else. We will need to put in place efficient safeguard measures and things like that, but there is no reason, and this is the point of this portion of my message, there is absolutely no reason to destroy irreplaceable forest for luxury goods. We can use timber from plantations, and this will fit many of what we have to do. What to do, and I'd like to close there. I think I still have 2 or 3 minutes. What to do? It is obvious when we look at how forest has been managed so far. It is obvious that forest management as conducted so far should be stopped. It cannot continue. Either we stop it when we still have some forest, or it will be stopped very quickly because there will be no forest left to sustain this business. So we have to change. We have to stop it. We have to stop the trend to forest conversion. It's easy to say, it's much more difficult to do, and I have 3 points, 3 suggestions, 3 ways forward. First, we have to look at ways to restore forests that are degraded forests, I will say. We need to find a way to restore these forests. And the best way will be to create incentives for restoration by putting forest communities back in the driver's seats of forest management. And this can be done by recognizing their collective property over land and resources. By doing so, they will be back in control and they will have incentive for restoration. I think this is the first step that we need to do. Then we need to stop the destructive trend that is going on so far. The destructive trend is both illegal logging and legal but unsustainable logging. And when I say this, it means basically all logging operations in natural forest has to be all industrial, large-scale logging operation in natural forest will have to be stopped. How to stop them is very simple. Many companies are already breaking the laws and there is no reason for them to continue. To have quick gains at the expense of humanity and of our future. So they can be sent out as quickly as possible. And the third thing that we have to do, and when I say 1, 2, 3, it's not in that order. I think we have to do that simultaneously. Restoration, stopping the destructive trends, and shifting the market to alternatives to timber from natural forest by coming back or trying to put more incentive on timber from plantations. Thank you for your attention, and I will be ready to elaborate a bit more on any of those points during the question and answers.
Thanks, Samuel. And indeed, you can start asking the questions in the chat function below the Q&A, and you can do so in whatever language, in Portuguese, French, Spanish, or English. So we started this morning with some radical ideas already, in the sense of, for example, should we be considering to ban industrial forest operations? And when it comes to land tenure, are we considering the possibility of having a radical agrarian reform? Are we considering the possibility of having forest minimum income? And what's the role of community forestry? Would it be interesting to think about making local communities co-owners of business? And where is radical transparency in all of this? And how younger change makers could be playing a role and providing new leadership we need for forests? And should we be thinking about education, reforming the curricula, and perhaps teaching solidarity and empathy, not only to school kids, but also in higher education? So these are overall some of the ideas that we are addressing today. Thanks, Samuel, for bringing some of these already and also connecting with the next presentation. You have Penguin. It will focus on reforestation, ecological reforestation. Let me just give a quick intro, a short by you. Well, Fan Yuan. So Fan Yuan is assistant professor at Peking University. Her research focuses on land use change, grounded in ecology, and on policy opportunities for conservation, which also includes social sciences. And then, in today's talk, she'll focus on how forest restoration can best benefit biodiversity and the climate. Fan Yuan?
Thank you very much, Thiago. You can hear me okay, right? I assume. So hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you, Samuel, for your wonderful, well, very excellent talk. It's a very nice segue into my presentation. So like Thiago said, I'm a conservation ecologist with an interest in forest biodiversity conservation. And today, I'm going to share some of my thoughts about how we can best achieve biodiversity and climate benefits from forest restoration. So just a bit of scene setting here. Let me see if I can change my slides. Right. We know that the loss and degradation of the world's forest ecosystems, like Samuel talked about, is a huge environmental challenge and certainly a key challenge for forest governance. A very good illustration of this challenge is actually the world's intact forest landscapes, which Samuel also referred to. So according to a 2017 study in Science Advances, and I should just define the term intact forest landscape. It refers to large expanses of forest with no obvious signs of human disturbance or human degradation. So this study mapped out the extent of the world's intact forest landscape globally. And we can see that not only are we reducing dramatically the extent of the world's intact forest landscapes, but the speed of disturbance and destruction is also speeding up or has signs of speeding up. Now, this kind of loss or forest loss and degradation has enormous biodiversity and climate consequences. So perhaps one of the best indices to look at in terms of biodiversity impacts of such loss and degradation is what's called the Living Planet Index. As we can see on the screen here, ever since the record began in the 1970s, this index, which basically measures the abundance of wild living species, has continued to decline. And actually the value in 2014 compared to 1970 was a 60% drop, which is a really drastic or quite a stark number to contend with. So a lot of this loss in biodiversity is actually caused by habitat loss, but we can say with fair, certainty that a lot of this forest loss caused biodiversity loss is attributed to forest-related land degradation. Now, what about climate impacts? According to IPCC assessment, forest degradation and loss actually accounts for about 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So this again is a fairly big number. Amid this gloom and doom, maybe one reason for hope is actually that the world is finally mobilizing to conduct or to call for and conduct and scale up forest restoration. We have a large number of international, regional, and national mechanisms to promote forest restoration on different scales. There's also increasing discussion among policymakers about letting or encouraging the two leading conventions on biodiversity conservation and climate change to work more closely together. And forest restoration is actually one of the key links for these mechanisms to work more closely together. So now the question actually becomes, how can we best do this? How can we best achieve the promise of biodiversity and climate change brought about by forest restoration? So to look at this question, let's actually first look at what existing science tells us. So according to a global scale meta-analysis put together by Renato Chrysalis and his colleagues, they did a meta-analysis on how the world's tree plantations versus secondary forest, which is the outcome of natural regeneration. So actually native forest as a result of natural regeneration, how tree plantations and secondary forest might compare to each other in supporting biodiversity. And we can see from the figure here already that the performance of biodiversity for secondary forest outperform tree plantations. Now, my own study, together with my colleagues, echoed the same finding that native forests support a higher level of But so this work was conducted in southwestern China, in Sichuan province. But I think I would like to even more, I guess, highlight another finding coming out of this, which is that we found that compared to cropland, which is a land that was being reforested with this kind of tree cover, compared to cropland, monoculture tree plantations actually supported less biodiversity compared to what was supposed to be reforested. So this indicates that at least in some systems, monoculture style reforestation can actually do more harm than good, at least in under some the conditions of some research systems. Now, what about climate? And here's another fairly influential study coming out of the UK in 2019. Simon Lewis and his colleagues put together an assessment of the carbon storage potential of Bomb Challenge. Like if all the 350 million hectares of land was to be reforested in different styles, meaning what if it's going to be reforested with plantations versus what if it's going to be reforested with native forest? And what is the carbon outcome from these? And the conclusion coming out of this study is basically that native forest has 40 times higher carbon storage potential than tree plantations, and its restoration would be essential if the world is going to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate goal. So I guess it's safe to say up until now that existing science points to the paramount importance of restoring native forest if we were to achieve biodiversity and carbon benefits. But I would like to actually ask a question here, that does this fully address the question of how we can best achieve biodiversity and carbon benefits? And the reason why, or one important reason why I ask this question is a hard reality we humans and our society live with, which is that in addition to biodiversity and carbon and all the other environmental benefits coming out of forest, human society actually has more demands of, or more expectations of forest ecosystems. And one of these demands is actually about timber. So eventually, timber production for society, for our consumption, has to come from somewhere. And like Samuel talked about so eloquently, timber harvesting is a main driver of forest loss and degradation. So to kind of approach this question that I posed of whether what I said just now based on existing science actually fully addresses the question. So let's first take a look at two forested landscapes in China, which is where I work. So here's one photo that I took this year in southwestern China in Sichuan province. And what we see here is a reforested landscape where under the government scheme of what's called Grain for Green, the government actually incentivized rural households to retire their crops. There's sloped cropland, meaning cropland on hill or mountain slopes into forest. And because this program has the central goal of controlling soil erosion, the government incentive system is basically targeting any kind of tree cover. So you're free to choose what kind of tree cover you restore or you reforest. As long as it's trees or tree cover, it qualifies under the program. So here we have this photo showing a patchwork of different kind of tree cover being put in place. For the most part, Japanese cedar and also bamboo in this landscape. Now, turning our sight into another part of China, which is in the southeast, in Guangxi province. So what we see here in the background is actually large-scale monoculture eucalyptus plantations. And it's actually part of China's effort to protect our existing native forest by establishing and operating high-yield, high-intensity eucalyptus plantations to produce timber, with the argument that the timber produced can thus relieve pressure from existing native forest. So we see a fairly highly mechanized harvesting system harvesting 6-year-old eucalyptus trees. And actually, after talking to some forestry researchers, I realized that a lot of people in the forestry sector here in China believe, or at least agree, that the establishment of such high-yield monoculture eucalyptus plantations in this particular province has contributed significantly to China's reducing harvesting of our, as well as international native forest. So looking at these two landscapes, so we have two systems where forest restoration did not really restore native forest, and instead what they restored was either mixed plantation or monoculture plantations. So based on the science I briefly touched upon just now, obviously or apparently these systems did not really probably fall short of delivering the full biodiversity and carbon potential of forest restoration. But there is another side to this situation, which is that there is reason to argue or to contend that if these restored forest covers can indeed produce timber, and preferably at high yields, then it's conceivable that they may have the effect of sparing harvesting pressure on existing forests, including the very precious intact forest ones, like I showed in the beginning of my slide, as well as what Samuel talked about, and in turn generates possibly greater overall biodiversity and carbon benefits. So I guess, in essence, what I'm talking about or highlighting is a potential leakage effect of forest restoration, whereby if you restore high-yielding plantations, yeah, they may not have very good on-site benefits, but there may be positive leakage effects to think about. So coming back to my question, what would a full answer to the initial question that I proposed in terms of how do we best achieve biodiversity and carbon benefits of forest restoration? What would a full answer to that question look like? And I would want to argue that there are several things to it. One is that this answer must consider not only the local effects, but also potential leakage effects. And only combining these two aspects do we have a more robust and reasonable assessment of the overall impacts of forest restoration. The second point I would like to make is that forest restoration and the management of restored forests should be or must be integrated with other forest management tools. And a very, very crucial aspect of this toolbox is actually the protection of existing native forests, especially the old growth forests, because we know that, multiple scientific research has already demonstrated the irreplaceable value of old growth forests. And I guess linking these things together, I would also want to highlight the role that sound science can play in obtaining this full answer. And I guess by now, you would have guessed that actually in the current scientific research, we don't yet have a full answer to this question. And it remains a research frontier that scientists should be looking at. So I think I would just end my presentation here with what I consider the take-home messages. One, we know from existing science that native forest restoration would be the best for biodiversity and carbon benefits on site. But considering the leakage effects, I would also want to argue that forest restoration should be approached as an integrated component of managing our world's forest resources. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't overrun my time, and I will be happy to answer questions later during the discussion session. Thank you.
No, you didn't. Thank you very much, Franklin. Thanks for staying well within time. And yes, forest restoration is the way forward. We have the bond challenge. We have the ideas of preserving half of the planet for biodiversity, wild ecosystems. And then, before we move to the next panelist, Vanessa, I would like to run a quick poll. I'm launching it right now. So we are initially asking you your views on how you perceive mainstream forest governance currently. And we have a short series of 4 questions here. I would ask the translators for a little help in here. But the first question is, mainstream forest governance has primarily been informed by social sciences, natural sciences, interdisciplinary studies, participatory and transdisciplinary knowledge, or none of the above. The second question is, mainstream forest governance has primarily been centered on people and the human nature, or the non-human nature, or nature, both human and non-human, or none of the above. Third question, mainstream forest governance has primarily been encouraging longer supply chains and the interest of corporations and financial institutions, or shorter supply chains and the interests of small and medium enterprises, or any kind of market, no matter if in short or long chains, or none of the above. And finally, for mainstream forest governance has been primarily reducing inequalities in its multiple dimensions, reducing income poverty, but not reducing other types of inequality, such as opportunities, for example, or mainstream forest governance has been primarily increasing inequalities, or none of the above. So we've just used this as a thermometer to understand how we as a group today, so it's, of course, it's biased, of course, it's not representative of any kind of sample, but just to have an idea of where we see things happening. And then at the very end of the panel, I'll get back to these questions and asking you, how do we think we should be going forward? So I can see some people are still responding, but just for to keep it within time, I went the poll and show and share the results with you. I'll give 30 more seconds for those who are still trying to find an answer. Thank you. Okay, can you see the results on your side? Okay, so first question, it seems that mainstream forest governance has primarily been informed by 30% of the respondents are saying natural sciences, almost 30% are saying none of the above, and not so much on participatory and transdisciplinary knowledge or social sciences. For the second question, it seems that mainstream forest governance has been focusing on people and the human nature, so not so much on the non-human nature, and has been primarily encouraging longer supply chains and the interests of corporations and financial institutions, and only 2% said that mainstream forest governance has encouraging shorter supply chains. And finally, it seems that the respondents believe that the current work on forest governance has been increasing inequalities, which might be a bit worrisome. So very few think, or 11% think that it's reducing inequalities in its multiple dimensions. That's a more positive outcome. So yeah, so we have a sense of where we are assessing current forest governance global regime now. So lots of food for thought, and let's move to the next panelist, Vanessa Nakate. Vanessa is a climate activist. She was the first Friday for Future activist in Uganda, having led the campaign to save the Congo forest, and is founder of the Rise Up movement, a movement which amplifies the voices of activists from Africa. Vanessa, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be speaking at this event. My name is Vanessa Nakate, and I'm a climate activist from Uganda. The animals have a lot to teach us, but we never pay attention. The birds have too much to tell us, but we are not ready to listen. The forests are speaking. Earth is our dwelling place. We need to protect it like our lives depend on it, because they do. How can we ensure proper management and conservation of our forests? First of all, we need to think about the people who directly benefit from these forests. These are the local communities that dwell in these forests. Many times, we forget about their opinions and what they have to say in regards to conservation of the forests. But putting their ideas, their opinions, and bringing them into decision-making processes is enough to help us move towards proper forest governance across the world. We need to respect the rights of these local communities that directly relate with the forests, that directly defend the forests, that directly protect these forests. We need them to be included among the key forest stakeholders to ensure proper conservation. We cannot continue ignoring their views. We cannot continue ignoring their voices because they are the defenders of these forests. We need to respect the knowledge of these people, indigenous wisdom, indigenous knowledge. They have been able to protect the forests that we see for many years. They have defended them from people who have tried to destroy and cut them down. We need their wisdom in how they've been able to preserve our forests for a very long period of time. Many times we focus on the wisdom that is brought by those who are known to be the top leaders or the top stakeholders, but we need to go to the ground. What are the defenders saying? What is the wisdom that they're giving us in conservation of this forest? We cannot go forward with proper forest governance while ignoring the voices of the indigenous people that are protecting these forests. And we also realize that it is the women who directly work in these forests. They relate with these forests. They get food for their families from these forests. They get medicine from these forests. For example, when I talk about the Congo rainforest, over 70 million people depend on the existence of these forests directly. But most of the women who carry out the work, who provide for their families from what the forests provide, we don't see them on the conversation. We don't see them in discussions. So we need more equality when it comes to the stakeholders in forest governance. We need more women in the decision-making processes because they do the groundwork, especially in the marginalized communities. I come from Uganda. It's a country in Africa. And you realize that the people in the rural communities where we find most of the forests, the ones who do all the work, the preservation, the provision of food, the provision of medicine, it is the women. But when it comes to discussion about how we can protect the forests that they protect, the forests that they provide, for their families, we don't see them on the discussion. We need more women. We need them involved if we want to make proper decisions, because they have that heart, because they know how much the forests are vital to them. That is why we shouldn't exclude them. They must be included in the decision-making processes of ensuring proper management and conservation of our forests. We see many laws, many rules, many regulations that are put in place, but it is one thing for laws to be put in place. It is another thing for the laws to be enforced and implemented. Many times, people have gone away with destruction of forests. Something one can say how to get away with murder. If people continue to destroy the forests without being held accountable, then we cannot go forward. We have the laws. There are rules, but are we implementing these rules? Are we enforcing these rules? Or we are letting people just go ahead with destroying the forests without doing anything? The fossil fuel industry is planning to construct a gas pipeline within the Congo rainforest. But are we going to hold them accountable for this action? Or are we going to let it pass? If there are rules, they must be enforced. They must be implemented. And measures need to be put on the demand side. We understand there is so much demand for timber. What if we come up with alternatives? I come from a country whereby most of the schools use firewood for preparation of food, preparation of water for the students, for the teachers. But there are alternatives to this. There are eco-friendly stoves, but not all these schools are able to access these stoves. Not all of them are able to afford these stoves. But we can make this happen. There are stakeholders. There are countries that can make this happen. We need to provide these alternatives. Yes, we may tell them that these are the alternatives to using firewood, to using timber. But are we going to give them these alternatives? Most of them are just trying to meet their daily needs. So they're not ready to implement any of those alternatives without any help. So we need more resilience and more construction of such projects, building such projects in schools, in these communities that heavily depend on firewood, especially for preparation of food. Because that is one of the main causes of deforestation in developing countries, because people use firewood to prepare food. But there are alternatives, but many people cannot afford these alternatives. That is why we need to work as much as possible to bring these alternatives to people. Because it is possible, the solutions are there, but they only need to be implemented. And there should be banning of sale and import of illegal logging. Of course, I understand these rules must be there under forest governance, but as I said, if the rules are there, they must be enforced. People need to be held accountable. They shouldn't get away with it. That is the only way they will see that if you mess with the ecosystem, you have to pay for it, because these are life support systems of the people, of the planet. Our existence depends on the existence of these forests, of the ecosystem. Wildlife depends on the existence of these forests. So whoever destroys them needs to be held accountable. Enough of people getting away with it. And also, there is so much forest information. There is so much science in regards to forests. But the communities that protect these forests, they don't understand some of this information. So this information needs to be made more available in the language that people understand. I won't go to a community and tell them that do not cut down because this species is the last that we have. They won't understand the language of species. But if the forest-related information is given to these communities, especially the defenders, if they get this information in the language that they understand, they will know better how to ensure the conservation of the forests. We need more information out there. People can only protect what they know is in danger. If I don't know that my house is burning, how will I try to escape? How will I try to go out? So people need to know. But then the information that gets out, it is too complicated. It is too scientific. It is mostly for the educated. But there are many people in those local communities. Some of them haven't had the opportunity of going to school. The only way that this information can be made available to them is by bringing it in the language that they understand. I believe that we are able to have a future that enables the protection of the forests if only people understand that our existence depends on the existence of our ecosystem. They will fight for their existence, they will fight for the protection. I can't do this alone. You can't do it alone. Everyone is needed if we want to ensure that our forest resources are properly managed and conserved. Thank you very much.
This is truly inspiring, Vanessa. Thank you so much. And in a very short presentation, Vanessa managed to provide practical advice on social justice, on the role of women, indigenous populations, peasants, rural communities, and intergenerational equity, of course, because we are talking about not the benefits we are enjoying today, but also the benefits and the resources, assets future generations would be keen to have the opportunity to use wisely them as well. And which language are we using? That's a very good question. How can we connect better? And is perhaps transdisciplinary knowledge a way forward if you want to get closer to what people need and believe and know about their environment ecosystems? So these are all issues around our theme today, emerging and radical ideas, sorry, for forests. And without further ado, Bhaskar. Bhaskar is professor of political economy here at Cambridge University. His research examines the political economy of human-environment interactions. And for his contributions to interdisciplinary research on environment and development, Bhaskar received the Royal Geographical Society Medal. Bhaskar, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tiago, and thank you for your kind introduction. I also want to thank Chatham House for many decades of global leadership, and in particular in terms of convening this global forum on forest governance and for inviting me to speak. I'm also really grateful to my fellow panelists, Samuel, Fangio, and Vanessa, who've really set up the conversation very well, and I think I have very little to really add. I want to thank those who prepared the background videos, which were very stimulating, and I'd really strongly recommend that colleagues on the call see them in case they haven't had a chance to see them yet. I'm also really grateful to so many people who are participating in this online, and I look forward to the conversation. Tiago, thank you for doing that poll. It was really fascinating to see the results of the poll. I, of course, as somebody who's based in a sort of academic setting, was particularly interested in the response to the first question about the disciplines that have had an influence on forest governance. And so I speak here as somebody who has a training in the social sciences, who's committed quite a lot of my career to promoting interdisciplinarity. And I've done a lot of my research in the field with communities, trying to understand how institutions for participatory governance might be more effective. The three which were highlighted as being least represented in the poll that you conducted, at least from the opinion of those who are on this call. So I hope I can bring some of the social science voice, some of the interdisciplinary voice, and some of these concerns to the table. I think what Samuel, Vanessa, and Fangio have laid out very nicely is the scale of the challenge, as well as some of the kind of dimensions of what we need to look at in terms of solutions. I'm taking away from their really inspirational presentations questions that we really need to address centrally around voice, around understanding history, understanding what has worked in the past, learning lessons so that those can be implemented in terms of future solutions. Because what's interesting to think about is that the spaces that we occupy here might feel novel in the 21st century, but equally there is a lot of history to learn from. And I think we can benefit from some of that history. I've talked about this in the context of the challenges for what is often called FLR, or Forest and Landscape Restoration, or REDD+, and various other sort of high-level, high-profile, very well-meaning suggestions that have emerged, I would say, in the last decade or a little bit longer, which could really benefit from learning from history. So one of the areas that, in particular, Vanessa's intervention sort of reminds me of is that in the 1970s, we tried to do something very similar, motivated perhaps by slightly different concerns, because the concerns of the 1970s were different. The interventions in the 1970s were really motivated by a rural energy crisis, very similar to what Vanessa currently describes, in terms of the need for people to have alternative fuel wood because of their high dependence on wood fuel for cooking. What people thought was going to be a rural energy crisis. And of course, the trigger in the 1970s had been the sudden rise in oil prices, which meant that the questions around rural energy became really sharply focused. Huge campaigns globally for what was in that decade called social forestry, but trying to do the same sorts of things, trying to encourage people to plant trees. In those cases, the incentives were meant to align so that people planted trees for their own domestic fuelwood consumption. And the practice that we have observed over that period suggests that I wouldn't maybe say it was a complete disaster, but it certainly didn't seem to result in the scale of large-scale afforestation that people expected. The work that I'm familiar with, which was largely focused in India, suggests that the motivations for people to plant trees were very different to what people expected. People certainly didn't plant trees as a fuelwood species for self-consumption. What you found instead was very large-scale conversion to monoculture plantations of the type that Fangyan was talking about for what became local markets. Eucalyptus and poplar were the two most widely planted species. What we also found was that it was taken up largely by affluent farmers and not by those living in marginal lands. So what it suggests is that very well-meaning interventions designed with the best outcomes in mind often fail to reach the beneficiaries in terms of creating the right incentive structures for them to respond in the ways that we might expect them to, hope that they do. So I think there's a lot we can learn from, because this is human behavior. This is the sort of missing piece when Fangyan was mentioning that we need a full answer, and demonstrated how strongly we need to integrate the different elements of the scientific and ecological understanding of how forested and tree-based systems work. We also need to bring in the people into that equation, because ultimately it's people's behavior that is going to allow these interventions to sustain themselves over time. Why do people respond in certain ways? How did they treat their land use options, and how do they respond to the incentives that might be created through these interventions that are now being planned? There's a hope sometimes that we might find this elusive win-win so that everyone is better off. I think my understanding as somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about the political economy questions is that usually there are trade-offs, and we need to manage those trade-offs. We need to understand that the benefits and costs are very unequally distributed, and those often are distributed unequally amongst groups that occupy very different positions in terms of power relations, in terms of governance and choices over the landscape. Much of the experience that's been documented shows that interventions have often have lacked transparency, have lacked accountability. They sometimes tick boxes to perform what might be seen as collaboration, but aren't really deeply meaningful in terms of giving voice in the ways that Vanessa and Samuel have been talking about to the intended beneficiaries of some of these interventions. And there's a failure to really understand the underlying conflict and to address it in the context of these interventions. So what I would be advocating is, let's look back at history rather than trying to reinvent new interventions under the labels of FLR and RED+, which don't take advantage of the fact that we have, I would say, well over 50 years of similar interventions across a variety of landscapes. And I wouldn't write them all off. They haven't all failed. So let's learn from the successes and let's learn from the failures. But in particular, highlight things like the need to directly confront these asymmetries of power and recognize that some of the most vulnerable groups have their interests tightly linked up with forest and land use, and protect their interests as a primary concern when we're implementing these new strategies. I really love the way Vanessa talked about accountability, and I think it's really important that accountability isn't just upwards to donors, but it's downwards to the supposed and intended beneficiaries of these interventions. How do we create inclusive structures in which authority gets devolved, decentralized, and accountability flows in both directions, up and down? Moving on to my next slide. Sorry, it's a bit laggy. I think the point that I would sort of emphasize is that forest landscape is essentially a political space. There's an inherent politics in making choices about how to use a landscape. I think Fangyan has already demonstrated the multiple uses that people make of a landscape. I think the sort of illustrations from some of the Chinese landscapes were really evocative, because you can see that there's a lot going on in these complex places. People are trying to farm, they're trying to feed themselves, they're trying to maintain the ecology, maintain the local water system, and also have to be conscious about their contribution to the global commons, if you want to call this the global commons. So ultimately, really, this is a choice which is being made in political space, and trade-offs are inevitable. Emphasizing one type of land use is going to mean that a different type of land use is no longer possible. We need to make those judgments quite transparently. And I think that's really important, that these choices need to be made visible and made transparent. And we need to have a serious conversation about which choices matter. The 21st century has brought additional demands on already pressurized landscapes. So the sorts of science that has become visible, and Fangyan very powerfully summarized, shows how important forest and land use is to confront some of the big global ecological challenges. The contributions to climate change, the contributions in terms of supporting water systems, the contributions to support ecosystem service provision, could in some senses, at least from my 50-year history, be seen as new demands upon already pressurized and conflicted landscapes. So what was already a difficult trade-off in the 1970s has become an even more difficult trade-off in the 21st century because of the additional needs to meet these other interests, also from the same habitats and landscapes. And the political question then is, who gets to decide what these landscapes should be used for? How are those decisions made? And in what forums are those decisions made? And that's the kind of critical governance question. What we also have to recognize is that the people who are making those decisions exercise power in very different ways. And there's a risk when we design interventions and solutions in the international conference halls that we forget the conversation in terms of including the voices of the people who are in other positions within that system, and the voices that, again, Samuel and Vanessa have been talking about so powerfully. How do we use systems of integrated decision making so that these voices are much more visible? I was really struck by a very powerful statement made earlier this week by a coalition of Southern African organizations working in Conservation Resource Africa, talking about how well-meaning campaigns led by celebrities can sometimes undermine local efforts, and how important it is for us to recognize that good intention isn't all we need. We need to go beyond good intention and actually perform in a serious way an accountability and an inclusion. So I want to just conclude with, we were asked to think about radical ideas. I don't think my idea is all that radical, actually. I think that these are things that we've been thinking about, hopefully should have been thinking about for a very long time. But actually, to contrast what I would see as a sort of potential technocratic approach to some of these questions, absolutely drawing on the best available science, but seeing this as some kind of an industrial engineering problem, as opposed to what I would say the political economy, political ecology perspective brings, which is much more conscious of the contested political landscapes in which these choices are being made. So what I would say is that we move from what you might see as a techno fix towards socially just transformational pathways. And that's my radical idea. Thank you.
That's a great way to wrap up our panel. Thank you, Bhaskar. Brilliant. So there are several issues here regarding equity. So we talked about social justice, intergenerational equity, geographical equity, the transboundary issues that sometimes a legislation in Europe affects what's going on in Indonesia. Also procedural equity, so transparency and accountability. What is the role in improving forest governance systems and improving the quality of forests and the quality of the lives and the well-being of people living in and around forests? So all of these questions are part of today's discussion. And I would like to start with the most voted question so far, and that comes from Angalia Putri Permatasari, and this goes to all of you. Van Baska, Samuel is there, and yes, Vanessa is there as well. So the question is, it focuses in Indonesia, but I think it goes beyond Indonesia. But in Indonesia, almost 3 million hectares of natural forests are already given to or located inside timber plantations concessions. In my mind, in Ngalia's mind, the radical idea is to buy back the forested land. But where will the money come from? That's why a global incentive scheme is needed so that those forests can be let to stand rather than chopped down. What's your perspective on this? So I would just add something to this question. Should we be considering to give compensations for the multinationals to devolve the forests to the indigenous and local populations? And the buyback would be through payments, money, but it's a more overall question. And who wants to pick on that? Pascal, please.
I'll try and make a start. I'm sure other colleagues will have views too. It's a really important question, and it's a question that has been asked in its various forms. I mean, Tiago, you'll be familiar with this question from a Brazilian context. It's a similar question which has been asked by colleagues in other countries. What are the impacts of foregone revenue generation or developmental opportunities that holding forests intact might raise? And how do we deal with the questions around who should pay for those foregone opportunities? And of course, some of the solutions that are potentially on the table are exactly trying to address that. There's been historically proposals around debt for nature swaps. There are historically proposals around trying to compensate for lost income. There are in India internal federal transfers to state governments to compensate them because they have a high forest cover and therefore have certain developmental opportunities that are not open to them. And I think obviously elements of what REDD+ is trying to do are precisely designed to try and reward people for intact forests or keeping trees in the ground. I want to sort of broaden that a little bit though and ask us to think about what this implies in terms of the baseline against which we are measuring change. So let me explain that in slightly different ways, which is if we accept that those concessions legitimize exploitation of those forests, then I think the question that was asked is absolutely legitimate, which is to say, how do we compensate people for the loss of those exploitation rights? On the other hand, you wouldn't necessarily advocate, paying somebody not to do something illegal. So if the baseline you start from is different, and if the baseline says that, exploitation of certain types is not acceptable, the property rights flow in a different direction. You may have to then not be talking about compensation, but it may be just about law enforcement. It depends very much on what the baseline property rights situation is. Are those exploitation rights effectively handed over so that people are at liberty to privately exploit those resources? Or are those resources held in other ways? Who has the right to decide what the baseline property rights situation should be? Because the question of compensation only then emerges. The question of compensation emerges once you've actually clarified the legal regime that underpins whether or not this type of land use is legal or illegal. So I guess there's a sort of broader question, but I do see where that the original intervention is coming from. Thanks, that's all from me.
Thank you. I wonder if Vanessa, Van and Samuel would have anything to add or comment. Otherwise, I'll move to a question to you. Is Samuel there? was struggling earlier today with the connection. So this is a question to Van from Garrett Hansen. Would it not be relatively straightforward for the Chinese government to give subsidies in the green for grain? Did I get that name correctly? Program conditional on the planting of appropriate tree species, also with a view to future climate change. Is this happening?
Thank you, Gareth, for the question. I think it's a very, very good and thoughtful question. So actually under the Green for Green, so the name is actually Green for Green. It's kind of, I think either way it actually makes sense, but the name the Chinese government has been using is Green for Green in the sense that initially when the program was conceived, the payment kind of scheme, the incentive scheme was in the form of grain. Like the government was literally hand out like food, grain, like rice or wheat to households. So that's how the name came about. Now, under that program itself, there was no difference in terms of compensation, the level of reward or compensation that the government gives out. And that's precisely the reason why you have these rural households gravitating towards plantations as their answer to the program. So in other words, there's no added benefit to restoring native forest. And that's the reason why people are not doing that. But I kind of mentioned in my answer to this now in time that there's still encouraging sign that the Chinese government has finally been listening to sign, have been arguing for years that native forest restoration makes sense. So now you increasingly hear from talking stop encourage natural generation. And there's this really interesting narrative about, because we used to plant a lot of trees in ecosystems where trees don't actually belong. Now you see government narratives coming out saying wherever there's wherever forest belongs, let's restore forests, and depending on natural regeneration to restore forests. But if the natural ecosystem is not forest, then we should stick to the original native reference baseline. So I think that's a very encouraging development coming out of government policy, but that's not specifically under the Green for Green program. But I think the point that Garrett mentioned is very, very good, which is that the incentive system is key in this kind of government schemes to bring out the desirable outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Franklin. Just to remind, if you prefer posing your questions orally, verbally, please just raise your hands. That would be great to hear your own voices rather than having me reading out your questions. But I'll move on to a next question to all panelists on responsibility of OECD countries by Adrian Green. So he's saying, OECD countries largely took 1,000 years to deplete forests and have spent the last 3 decades part rebuilding some forest. But our focus on developing world forests and poor people rather than OECD countries and their responsibilities to restock for the last 1,000 years. Is this cultural colonialism? Can OECD countries pay developing communities to buy back forestry?
Well, I think that the damage that was caused probably very, very many years ago cannot be undone, The forests have been destroyed, a lot of damage has been done. So what can these countries do? First of all, they need to understand the impacts that were caused because of the damage. The lack of access to food, lack of access to water, people being homeless, and finding out ways of helping out. If they had the capacity to cause all this damage, then they have the capacity to bring a cure to the problems that they caused. That is by helping these communities build more resilience. When I talked about some of the projects or some of the alternatives, now this is where they can come in to drive these projects, to divert finance to these projects and bring alternatives. to these communities so that even the existing forests don't undergo destruction. And then they can help out in planting more trees, growing more forests, because we still have land. But there is something that they can do. Of course, they cannot do the damage that was already caused, but they can try to build for a future that is much better by building resilience in these communities, by financing projects that are restoring ecosystems in these communities, and by supporting the voices and bringing them to the tables of discussion in regards to protection of the ecosystem. So there is a lot they can do. They may not be able to undo the damage, but they can be able to help out in moving towards a better future for this community.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think someone wanted to say something as well.
Yes, very quickly to say that I don't think we are still at the level where we should be thinking about individual trajectories of countries or group of countries. We are all in the same boat. And if things become worse here because the forest is being totally destroyed, we will feel it. We will be the first to feel it, but we will absolutely not be the only ones to feel it. And when we feel it, the situation in OECD countries will become worse because in the process of finding solutions, a lot of pressure will be put on countries where the conditions or the situation seems to be better. So I don't really think we should try to close ourselves and try to find individual solutions. And I fully agree with Vanessa. If you look in the past, there are reasons for the OECD countries to get involved. If you look at the situation today, there are also reasons for the OECD countries to try to find a solution. It's part of their responsibility, but they are not the only ones having this responsibility. We have to do something ourselves, but they should not say, okay, they have to be out of the discussion.
Thank you, Samuel. I have a question here directed to Franklin on moratorium on logging from Agnes Kikoto. Do you feel like a moratorium on logging can help in forest governance and especially recovery? Is this applicable in these high-yield timber producing areas back in China? Is there ownership by community members, or is it solely a government and corporations initiative?
Thank you for the question. So in the case of China, actually, you remember I mentioned the high-yielding eucalyptus plantations was part of the government scheme to protect existing native forest. So actually, in the same program, the government did install a moratorium on natural forest logging or native forest logging in some major forested regions in China. And that's one of the main reasons why our rapid depletion of native forest has been stemmed. So I think there is a point to be made about installing a strict protection mechanism for existing native forests in tandem with managing plantations. So, and that speaks to my point of arguing that forest restoration or management of plantations need to be thought of as integrated toolboxes for managing our forest resources. As for the specific context of the moratorium in China, it was helpful that actually the land, much of the land to which moratorium was applied was state-owned. But I think even if those land were community land, I think there is a reason to think that mechanism would have worked as well, because the moratorium in China functioned through providing compensations. So the state-owned land I mentioned, they were managed by timber plantation farms or timber concession companies, actually. And the government provided this kind of funding to them so that they can stop logging and they can convert those loggers, like people, workers, into tree planters or foresters. So I think there's something to be said about government providing the proper incentive system and compensation. And this goes back to Bhaskar's point about the premise, right? Whether this is legal to begin with. And I think I think that was a really powerful answer to the first question. So yeah, this is my answer to this current question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Fern. Bhaskar, a question for you from Garrett Hansen regarding your presentation and some of the suggestions there. So Garrett says, does the last slide suggested that WWF read on challenge, etc., part of the industrial approach, ignoring the social and political realities and the justice dimension? And based on your vast experience, is there any chance those actors could actually design their programs in an inclusive way?
Thank you. Good. And I'm aware that my colleague Bram Buscher, who prepared one of the background videos, is also on the call, and I would really recommend that colleagues have a chance to look at his video presentation if you haven't already done so. But one of the things that Bram talks about is the creation of a sort of nature-people dichotomy. A risk that we're actually separating the world out in certain ways. So I don't want to suggest that the proposals that we currently see on the table are neglectful of some of the things that I've been talking about. What worries me is when they go to scale so rapidly. When I see numbers like 350 million hectares, when I see numbers that are being talked about, when we talk about, for example, 50% of the planet, this is vast amounts of land. And certainly from my experience, and it may be a limited experience from South Asia, I don't see spare land lying around that people don't have uses for. So the mind boggles when you think about 20 million hectares in a country like India suddenly being brought under a different land use without taking into account what the current land use is and the interests of people who actually currently use those lands. So when I see non-spatially explicit commitments to very large levels of either natural regeneration or plantation or afforestation, I worry that that's being designed in an industrial ecology way, which is what I was sort of talking about, which is you're sort of drawing up maps based on remote sensing, but you're neglecting the possibility that there may be quite legitimate land uses on those lands which impact on the real lives of people on the ground. So my worry with the kind of large-scale commitments is that they are often not spatially explicit enough, and even if they're spatially explicit, they haven't necessarily taken into account the current and existing land uses and the lives of the people who depend on those land uses for their current subsistence. But I think there's work to be done. I mean, I think these are still raw proposals which can be refined further. So I don't want to sort of set up an unnecessary dichotomy, which could have been implied in my final slide. I think there are ways in which the political ecology approach could influence the ways in which industrial ecology is being conducted. But I think there is a risk that if we get driven too much by large-scale commitments and targets, we will speed up an approach which does neglect the sort of much deeper social questions that I and other colleagues have been pointing towards.
Thank you, Bhaskar. I'll move to the two final questions before we run the final poll. One is directed to you, Samuel, the other one to you, Vanessa. So to Vanessa, there's a question here by non-identified guest. Vanessa, how do you think we can bring an end to illegal logging? And I'll take this also already to ask Samuel. There's a question here by Manoharan. How can we make the local communities in the driver's seat of forest management as a solution? Any suggestions? Vanessa, can you start?
Thank you for that question. We all understand that illegal logging isn't just individual action. These are actions that are backed up by very big corporations, very big industries. So if we are to put an end to illegal logging, we need to start from the root cause. If we go after those who are sent to do the illegal logging, those are just individuals who are working for these corporations. who are trying to provide for their families, and in one way or another, they find themselves in that situation. So we need to go by the roots if we want to put an end to illegal logging. And this is why we have forest governance, to hold these corporations accountable for the actions that they're doing. They know that the rules are there. They know that the regulations are there. But they also know that they have been getting away with this for a very long time. So by putting an end to illegal logging, we must hold those who are responsible accountable for their actions. Maybe it could be a lesson for other people who are planning to destroy the forests. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Samuel.
Yes, thank you. I think the answer is very connected to what Vanessa has just said. Putting the local forest communities back in the driver's seats means also creating the conditions for fighting illegal logging. I'd just like to share one information. Do you know that it is impossible for communities in Central African countries in the Congo Basin to go to court to challenge a company for their illegal operations? The state only can do so because they are the owner of the forest. And we have very few cases where the state went against a company, a logging company. So we have a lot of illegal operations going on in the region. Because the owner of the impossible for me. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, you're back now.
Okay.
Yes. Well, you can continue.
Okay, I don't know when I got lost, but I was saying impossible for forest communities to go to court against a company operating illegally, logging illegally. Only the state can do so. Impossible for a forest community to go to court against a company that is not paying taxes, because taxes are state money and only the state can do so. So at the end of the day, monitoring illegal operations is the responsibility of the state, and the state has the exclusivity in doing this activity. If they don't do it, nobody else can do it. Putting the communities back in the driver's seat will mean that we recognize the forest is a common good, and everybody has a responsibility for that the forest is properly managed. It's like democratizing the risk for any company involved in illegal logging. If the law changes and everybody has the possibility of going to court against those involved in it, you will not know if it will come from a community or from an ending to be done. And the second point, lastly, the communities own the forest, does not take those rules into account. So logging rights are granted and companies come in. And this creates a very perverse spiral, in the sense that communities know if they continue protecting, at some stage a company will come in without any discussion with them and will harvest the timber. So they also get involved into illegal logging. It's the only way for them to get a portion of what they consider as being their good. And this is what we have to break by giving communities the full property of the land and forest. We will give them the possibility of selecting what will happen to their and of course, this will be done under the control of the state. but it will not only be, as it is the case today, the only responsibility of the state. We need to give the property back to the communities, and we need to have the state that has the property, the state the funds. I think this is too much concentration into the same hands.
Thank you, Samuel. We had some connection issues, but I think your message came across clearly to the audience. So moving to the very end of our panel, I'm afraid it felt to me it was too short, 1 hour and a half. I wish I could have more time talking to you. But then we were running the final poll in the background. So I'm really sorry for the non-English readers, but we'll just end the poll quickly now, just to have an idea of how we think of medium and long term and how forest governance should be strategically based on. So in the beginning, we saw that our current assessment is that mainstream forest governance is mainly based on natural sciences. And it seems that the community here today would say that we need to move towards more participatory and transdisciplinary knowledge. In terms of center, as far as I remember, I think we were saying that current forest governance has been focusing on people, and now people are calling for a vision integrating both human and non-human nature. And in terms of business, most respondents are saying that we should be encouraging shorter supply chains and the interest of small and medium enterprises. Just reminding that initially our perception or collective perception is that we've been focusing on supporting longer supply chains. And finally, in terms of what it should be encouraging, that's the same question there. So I think that's basically it. So it's clear then that in terms of collective intelligentsia, we are seeing a great opportunity to have changes in the global governance of forest systems towards something that's more integrated and that takes local knowledges, indigenous populations knowledge, and geographical issues more seriously. That's also integrate human nature with non-human nature, and that it should be, instead of focusing on helping corporations to be more sustainable and green, it should be focusing on helping smaller, shorter supply chains for regional economies. So I think that could be perhaps some of the messages of this panel to the international community. And I'm aware that we are running out of time, and that's my fault as a chair. But I would really like to ask for final comments, if you don't mind. If I can ask you something more specific, I would ask you to say what would be your main recommendation in terms of practical action. So what should be done and by whom that would have the greatest impact, positive impact on forests and people. Who would you like to start? Laska.
I'll keep it very brief because I'm conscious of time. I think we've managed to spend an hour and a half on the panel talking about a number of the issues which we need to take forward. We are in a unique moment because in some senses, a lot of activity is on pause because of the pandemic, which gives us a very unique opportunity. 2020 was meant to be this super year for the environment where all the conventions were going to meet and there was going to be a real opportunity to integrate across all those different agendas. The pause, I think, is actually an opportunity to reflect on some of the things that we've been talking about. I think there are a lot of good intentions out there, but sometimes there isn't an opportunity to connect. We are in a unique moment where we are forced to slow ourselves down. And I think we should seize that moment to connect these different communities that, at least from some perspectives, are not talking to each other enough to learn from each other's perspectives. The knowledge is out there. There isn't a need for new knowledge to be generated. There's a lot we can learn from what we already know. But we need to find the time and space to listen seriously to each other and learn from each other. So I think a respectful treatment of the knowledge that already exists and an opportunity to bring those together, taking advantage of the pause, is probably my recommendation, so that when we emerge from this in 2021, we emerge with much more wise approaches towards these good intentions.
Indeed. Thank you, Bhaskar. Franklin?
Very well said, Bhaskar. I feel self-conscious about following you. And I think one comment popping up from the Q&A session was the topic of consumption. And I think that's a very, very good point about us as a community needing to work and be more aware that consumption of timber products, of agricultural products, sometimes unnecessary consumption, is driving all these environmental impacts as well as livelihood impacts. And another point I want to quickly make is I'm biased in terms of my perspective as a scientist, but I think there is scope for robust science to be done. And oftentimes, large-scale government programs they eventually do listen to scientists, and we need to have the evidence ready when. Thank you.
Thank you, Fanran. Indeed, Vanessa.
Well, I think for me, my last would be education, resilience, inclusiveness, restoration, and building back better. Thank you.
Clear, concise. Thank you, Vanessa. Samuel, are you still there? I think we lost Samuel. Oh, Samuel.
I'm here, but I'm not sure the connection is good enough to have the video.
I can hear you. Yeah, so let's
okay.
focus on that.
Okay, good. So I think we were very close of disappearing as humanity. This was a fear that we all had back in January, February, looking at the magnitude of the health crisis. So I think this put us in the right mode for thinking about the future. I think it can still happen. Maybe not from the COVID-19, but from something else. And I think it's the right time to start thinking about what to do. And my point is that the two conferences, the climate change and the biodiversity that were supposed to happen around the same time this year, I think we still have to do that. And I think the focus should be different. I think the focus should be looking at what we need to do differently to really make sure that we have a future and a future together. And forest, of course, will be part of family. The place of communities, the place of the poor will also have to be part of it. And for what we are discussing today, these two issues to me will have to be part of it. The poor and the forest as being part of our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. Thank you very much, Vanessa, Fanran, Bhaskar, and all of you. Thank you very much for your time, for joining us in a long journey of this 30th edition of the Global Forum on Forest Governance. And I hope to see you here next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and privilege.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you, Thiago. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.